My dad gave me a marriage ultimatum. I refused. I grew up in a family where appearances mattered. Not in a superficial way, but in a way that dictated every major decision. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, weren't just wealthy. They were obsessed with maintaining a certain standard. Our family wasn't in the billionaire league, but we were well above the average. Old money, wise investments, the kind of wealth that didn't just appear overnight. It was carefully cultivated over generations. And my parents took it upon themselves to ensure that their children, my sister Victoria and me, James, would continue this legacy the way they saw fit. Victoria was everything they wanted her to be. From an early age, she embraced the lifestyle, learning to move in high society with ease. She was beautiful, poised, and calculated in her decisions. And when she married Nathaniel Sterling, a multimillionaire businessman with an empire of luxury hotels, my parents beamed with pride. The wedding was a spectacle. Held at an exclusive estate in upstate New York, it was the kind of event that made it into magazines. The floral arrangements alone must have cost what an average family made in a year. Guests arrived in designer suits and gowns, sipping champagne older than I was. Every detail was meticulously curated, from the imported orchids to the crystal chandeliers that illuminated the grand ballroom. It wasn't a wedding. It was a performance of status. I stood on the sidelines, watching as Victoria embodied everything my parents had ever wanted. I wasn't jealous, far from it, but I knew that I saw things differently. I didn't care about wealth in the same way. Sure, I understood its importance, but I believed that relationships should be built on something deeper. What if all the money disappeared one day? Wouldn't it be better to have someone who loved you for who you were rather than for the life you could provide? My parents didn't see it that way. To them, love and wealth weren't separate entities. They were intertwined. Marrying below our standard wasn't an option. They tolerated my views with a certain level of patience, assuming I would come around. They spoke about my future wife as if she were a business investment, an asset that should align with our family's worth. And then came the setup. Nathaniel, my esteemed brother-in-law, introduced me to his younger sister, Charlotte. The moment my parents heard about her, they were thrilled. She was, after all, a Sterling born into money, raised in the same circles. It was, in their eyes, the perfect match. I, on the other hand, saw it for what it was, a transaction, a carefully arranged meeting to check off a box on their list of expectations. Charlotte was beautiful, well-educated, and had impeccable manners. On paper, she was exactly the kind of woman my parents would want me to marry. But something was missing. The moment we sat down together, I felt nothing. There was no spark, no depth in our conversation. It was as if she had been raised to play a role, to say all the right things but never reveal anything real. I tried to give it a chance. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe my parents were right and I was being too idealistic. But as we talked, I found myself unable to connect with her. She spoke of luxurious vacations, expensive art collections, and the importance of maintaining a certain image. And I realized, in that moment, that she wasn't looking for a partner. She was looking for someone who fit the lifestyle she had been trained to value. After that evening, I told my parents it wasn't going to work. My mother sighed, my father shook his head, but neither of them seemed surprised. They believed that, in time, I would understand the importance of their way of thinking. But I knew deep down that I never would. The pressure didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Subtle reminders about the responsibilities of our name, casual mentions of other eligible women from influential families, veiled comments about how I should consider my future more carefully. My life wasn't entirely my own. It was a blueprint they had designed long before I was even old enough to understand it. I wasn't against marriage. I wasn't against wealth. But I wanted something real, something that went beyond societal expectations. And as I watched my sister bask in the life she had chosen, I wondered if she ever had doubts. Did she ever stop to question whether Nathaniel was the love of her life, or simply the most strategic decision she had ever made? My parents expected me to follow the same path. As the days passed, my parents grew more persistent in their efforts to push me toward Charlotte. Every dinner conversation, every family gathering, somehow revolved around how perfect she was for me. My mother would praise her grace, her etiquette, her understanding of the world we belonged to. My father, ever the pragmatist, would remind me of the financial and social advantages of such a match. But I was unmoved. My heart simply wasn't in it. Tension between my father and me grew with each conversation. He was a man who believed in tradition and structure, and my refusal to comply was an affront to everything he had built. One evening, the argument reached its peak. He stood in the grand study, his voice trembling with restrained fury, and delivered an ultimatum. If I did not agree to marry Charlotte, I would not see a single penny of my inheritance. He spoke as if my financial future depended solely on him, as if my happiness was a negligible price to pay for family honor. I left the house that night without a word, my mind reeling from the weight of his words. I wandered through the city, the streets a blur as I tried to grasp what had just happened. The idea of marrying someone I felt nothing for, just to satisfy my parents' ambitions, was unbearable. The thought of being cut off financially was daunting, but the idea of sacrificing my own desires was even worse. As fate would have it, I found myself stopping by a quiet little cafe, one I had never been to before. It was nothing like the lavish restaurants my family frequented, just a simple, warm space with the scent of freshly brewed coffee hanging in the air. As I approached the counter, I noticed her. She was standing behind the register, her hands deftly moving as she prepared drinks and greeted customers with a genuine warmth that I rarely saw in my world. Her name tag read, Emily. She had an air of authenticity, something refreshing and real. There was no pretense, no calculated charm, just a person who seemed to be genuinely kind. She caught my gaze and smiled, and for the first time that evening, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Over the next few weeks, I found excuses to return to that cafe. Sometimes it was for a coffee, sometimes just to sit and work, but mostly it was to see her. We talked, slowly at first, about small things, books, music, the city. She had a simple yet profound way of looking at the world. She wasn't concerned with wealth or status. She cared about the people in her life, about making moments meaningful. With her, I didn't have to prove anything. I could just be myself. The more time I spent with her, the more I realized what I had been missing. My parents had spent years molding me into the image of a perfect heir, but Emily made me question whether that was the life I truly wanted. It wasn't just her presence that captivated me, but the way she lived, free from expectations, unburdened by pretense. One evening, as we walked through a quiet park, I found myself telling her about my family, my struggles, and the fight with my father. I had never confided in anyone this way before. She listened, not judging or advising, just listening. And in that moment, I knew I had found something real, something worth fighting for. Love had found me in the most unexpected way, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to stand my ground, not just against my father, but for my own happiness. It had been 2 months since I met Emily, and I was happy. She complimented me, we were on the same wavelength. I learned a lot about her. She told me that she really loved reading and had worked in a bookstore for a while, and that, in the future, she would also like to combine her profession with this. She really liked it when the children came and asked lots of questions. This time it was really good, and I decided not to let her go ever. So I was faced with the task of organizing a family dinner at which I was to introduce Emily to my family. I called her parents and told them that next weekend they should prepare for guests, and that it would be a real surprise. The day of the family dinner arrived with an air of expectation in my parents' house. My mother, Eleanor, had gone out early in the morning to buy the freshest ingredients. She wanted everything to be perfect. My father, Richard, made sure the dining room looked impeccable, polishing the silverware himself. A rare occasion for him. The house smelled of rosemary and roasted meat, and the warm scent of fresh bread filled the air. They were preparing for what they believed was going to be the announcement they had been waiting for. My engagement to Charlotte. Victoria, my sister, had asked me once more that morning if there was something she should know. I simply told her that she would find out during dinner, nothing more, nothing less. I saw her hesitate for a moment, as if trying to decipher a hidden message in my words, but she let it go. When I arrived at the house that evening, Emily by my side, I noticed the proud smiles on my parents' faces. They were certain they already knew the news. That changed the moment they saw who was standing beside me. The smile on my mother's face faded like a candle blown out by a cold wind, and my father's expression hardened. Victoria remained neutral, though I could tell she was watching them closely. Dinner was stiff and formal, lacking the warmth that usually filled the table. Emily, ever the kind-hearted soul, did her best to engage in conversation. She spoke about her job at the bookstore, her love for literature, and how she adored working with children who came in to explore the world of books. My mother's response was a curt nod. My father's only contribution was a gruff, interesting. Then came the inevitable questions. Where was she from? What did her parents do? Did she have any family connections? The more she answered, the more disappointed they seemed. Emily, unaware of the silent expectations my parents had built over the years, continued with a polite smile, though I could feel her growing unease. As the evening progressed, it became clear that my parents were struggling to mask their disappointment. After dinner, I excused myself momentarily, leaving Emily in the dining room. When I returned, she was gone. I caught sight of her through the window, walking swiftly, her hands wiping at her eyes. I rushed outside, calling after her. Tears streamed down her face as she told me what had happened. My father had spoken to her in my absence. He told her she was not suitable for me, that I had a future laid out that she did not fit into. But the worst part was the lie. He had told her that I was engaged to Charlotte, that I was merely toying with her feelings. That broke her. I had never felt such anger toward my father before. My entire life, I had been his son, the one who was expected to uphold our family's name, the one who had to follow the unwritten rules of status and prestige. But this was too far. That night, I made a decision. The following morning, I packed my bags. I had no intention of staying in a house where love came with conditions. As I carried my belongings down the stairs, my father stood in the doorway of his study, arms crossed. "If you walk out that door now," he said, his voice cold and firm, "do not come back. Not ever." For a brief moment, I hesitated. I had lived in this house my entire life. The walls held my childhood, my memories, my family. But then I remembered Emily's tear-streaked face, the way my father had broken her spirit with his words. I tightened my grip on my bags, gave my father one last look, and walked out the door. Time passed, and Emily and I built a life together. We married in a small ceremony, nothing like the extravagant wedding my sister had. But it was filled with love, surrounded by people who truly cared for us. We built something real, something that wasn't based on status or wealth but on genuine connection. As for my parents, they did not reach out for a long time. I knew that my father was a man of his word, and pride was something he held onto with an iron grip. But Victoria called me from time to time. She kept me updated on their lives, on how my mother secretly hoped I would come back, even if she never admitted it aloud. Years later, when Emily and I had our first child, my father finally called. His voice was different, less commanding, more uncertain. Perhaps, with time, he had realized that love is not something that can be dictated by wealth or status. Perhaps he had softened. Or maybe, he had simply grown old and lonely, realizing that his rigid views had cost him precious years with his son. Looking back, I do not regret my choice. It was difficult, yes, but the best decisions in life often are. Love is not about finding someone who fits into a mold created by others. It is about finding someone who makes you feel whole, someone who stands beside you not because of what you have, but because of who you are. And so, I ask you, whoever is listening to my story, have you ever had to choose between what was expected of you and what your heart truly wanted? If you have, I hope you found the courage to follow the path that was right for you, even if it meant walking away from everything you once knew.